Karoline Leavitt didn't walk into Columbia Law's panel expecting a brawl. She expected a coronation, a chance to flex polished talking points, flash her trademark smile, and maybe land a few Twitter-friendly zingers for the base. What she didn't expect was to be outmaneuvered in front of a national audience by a woman who never once raised her voice. It was 8:40 a.m., sharp on a Thursday, when the discussion began to rot beneath the surface. The stage was lined with polished wood, 4 chairs under cold studio lights, 3 cameras trained like rifles, and a control room producer who would later say, off the record of course, that the whole setup felt like pre-crack thunder. Judge Amy Coney Barrett had been holding court, so to speak, for nearly 10 minutes, hijacking the segment with the finesse of someone used to never being questioned. She batted aside the moderator's questions like gnats, pivoting between liberty, judicial restraint, and whatever buzzword passed for gravitas that day. She didn't speak, she pronounced, and she made it painfully clear that she didn't come to engage, she came to instruct. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt sat composed, spine straight, pen uncapped but unmoving, no fidgeting, no false smiles. She'd been called many things, disloyal, too young, too loud, but today she was something else entirely, prepared. Barrett had just finished a snide dig cloaked in judicial civility when the moderator finally turned. "Karoline," he asked, glancing her way, "do you have a response to that?" Karoline didn't flinch. Her gaze met Barrett's, clear and unshaken. "Sure," she said evenly, "but before I respond to her interpretation of my voice, maybe we should address why she's so determined to erase it." Silence. Crisp and immediate. Karoline reached into the Navy folder resting on her lap, something that had barely moved since she took her seat, and pulled out a single page. She held it up just long enough to catch the cameras, then passed it to the moderator without theatrics. "This," she said, calm but deliberate, "is an internal memo, circulated by members of Judge Barrett's advisory circle just 2 weeks ago. Reviewed, signed, and greenlit. It lays out a strategy targeting young conservative women who challenge judicial orthodoxy, not based on argument, but on image. Specifically, they want us framed as over-emotional, combative, and, my favorite, difficult to take seriously when we push back." Judge Barrett's mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Karoline pressed forward. It wasn't meant to be public, but it landed in my inbox. I waited before saying anything, wanted to verify it. Now that I have, well, if we're going to discuss ethics on camera, we may as well include the parts no one was supposed to see. Barrett snapped. "That's a lie," she spat, her judicial tone cracking. "You're lying. This is a setup. You're lying," Barrett snapped, though it sounded less like a refutation and more like a judicial verdict she was used to delivering without rebuttal. "This is a setup. You planned this." Her voice, normally fine-tuned to the frequency of Supreme Court ceremonial pomp, cracked like a cheap gavel under pressure. The courtroom caliber poise that had earned her reverence from conservative clerks and Christmas card lists across the Beltway was slipping fast. She looked to the moderator, Maddie Ortiz, who, to her credit, managed to freeze in a posture that could only be described as, "I did not sign up for this." Then Barrett's gaze darted toward the off-camera producers, hoping perhaps that one of them would leap in like a courtroom bailiff and object on her behalf. No one did. Barrett stood up, then sat back down so quickly she nearly knocked over her own nameplate. It was a small but telling moment, the kind of bodily confusion that happens when someone used to controlling the narrative realizes they're no longer in charge of the sentence, let alone the punctuation. "You think you can smear me with some fake piece of paper?" she barked. her tone climbing into a register usually reserved for scolding interns and denying reproductive rights. "You're trying to play the victim." Again, Karoline didn't blink. She didn't even adjust the crease of her blazer. "I'm not playing anything," she said, voice steady as a threat under cross-examination. "I'm just reading what your team wrote about people like me. And if that makes you uncomfortable, Judge, maybe ask yourself why it was written in the first place." The panel unraveled faster than a Fox News chyron on a slow news day. Dr. Lila Chaudhuri looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. The moderator made a feeble attempt to bring order, her voice cracking over the chaos like a substitute teacher trying to quiet a riot with a syllabus. One producer made the executive decision to cut to commercial. Too late. The final image before the fade-out? Barrett still mid-yell, her jaw clenched so tight you could have cracked granite on it. But the moment that truly detonated wasn't aired. It leaked. 14 seconds of raw, unfiltered footage. Barrett ripping off her lav mic with the grace of someone swatting a fly, pacing in half circles behind the set like a judge denied recess, muttering profanities into the air like a Shakespearean villain who just realized she's lost the soliloquy. She spun toward a shell-shocked producer and hissed, "She set me up." She knew I couldn't respond to that without looking guilty. And just like that, the mask slipped. Not because someone tore it off, but because it was never meant to be worn under fluorescent lights and live stream clarity. By 10 a.m., the footage was everywhere. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, even morning AM radio in Cleveland, which hadn't covered a political event since Watergate, unless there was free coffee involved. But it wasn't just the meltdown that captivated people. It was what it revealed, the moment when someone, finally, said out loud what so many had whispered for years in elevators, green rooms, and comment sections. Some attacks aren't about disagreement, they're about control. They're strategic. Precision-guided missiles disguised as panel questions. Of course, this televised implosion didn't come out of nowhere. The real story had started days earlier, long before the mic checks, the studio lighting, and the seating charts were finalized. 5 days before the panel, to be exact. Karoline Leavitt had been sitting at a modest cafe on Amsterdam Avenue, just off campus. The kind of spot where Columbia law students pretend to be poor and baristas pretend to care. She wasn't there for latte art. She was meeting someone who knew how the real game worked. And on that particular morning, her friend Grace Lynn wasn't pulling any punches. "She's not debating you," Grace said, slowly spinning her spoon through a lukewarm cappuccino that neither of them had touched. "She's baiting you. That's the whole setup. Push you hard enough, wait for the cracks, then call you the problem." Karoline didn't argue. She just gave a half smile, one of those tight, knowing ones you wear when someone says out loud what you've already accepted. "I know," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "She wants a spectacle. I want clarity. So no, I'm not giving her the fireworks she ordered." But even as the words left her mouth, Karoline's thoughts were turning faster than her tone led on. This wasn't the first time Judge Barrett had gone after her. Far from it. They'd crossed paths before, in interviews, closed-door roundtables, off-the-record panels where Barrett played the role of intellectual monarch, and Karoline was treated like a well-dressed disruption to the natural order. Barrett had a talent, no, a method, for condescension. She didn't insult you outright. She offered concerns about your temperament, reflections on your qualifications, always in public, never in private, and always with that same icy composure that turned gaslighting into performance art. 2 weeks earlier, Karoline had started hearing whispers, offhand comments from friends in media, cryptic DMs from campaign staffers she barely knew. Something about a strategy session held in chambers. Phrases like emotional calibration, messaging optics, and, most curious of all, unravel potential. Nothing concrete, just the kind of vague breadcrumbs you file under watch your back. Then, it came. An email. No sender name, no message body, no explanation. Just one attachment. Draft, memo, messaging, barrettteam.pdf. The subject line simply read, internal only. Karoline stared at the file for a long time before clicking. In her world, this kind of thing could be anything. A hoax, a honeypot, a well-placed smear. But after 3 days of encrypted calls and back-channel verifications, including one from a legal producer with more skeletons than drawers, she got her answer. It was real. Not just real. Strategic, polished, and unmistakably damning. The memo didn't criticize her arguments. It didn't analyze her policy ideas. It didn't even pretend to care about substance. No. It was a manual for psychological warfare disguised as professional feedback. It named her directly. Karoline Leavitt, quote, is vulnerable to credibility erosion via tone manipulation. One section detailed how to corner young dissenters in ways that trigger visible frustration, then use their reactions as post hoc justification to question their professionalism. Another line, clearly tested in focus groups, suggested, let her get assertive, then call it rehearsed. If she doesn't react, call it hollow. Either way, you win the narrative. She read that line 5 times, then 10. The phrases burrowed in, venom without a drop of blood. And what struck her wasn't just the tactical cruelty. It was the elegance, the cold, legalistic phrasing. The memo had been written not with malice, but with detachment. The kind you find in footnotes of dissenting opinions. Calculated, distant, deeply personal without ever sounding it. She didn't show it to anyone. Not yet. Not even her strategist. Not even her own communications lead. She wasn't ready to weaponize it. She wanted to understand it, to feel the temperature of it, to measure the silence between its lines, because it wasn't just a blueprint to destroy her. It was a mirror held up to every woman like her, too ambitious, too vocal, too off-script to be welcomed, but too visible to ignore. And once Karoline saw it for what it was, the only thing left to decide was what to do with it. Any woman who's ever been told to lower her tone, smile more, or watch her temperament knows the drill. Karoline didn't need a decoder ring to see the play. They weren't coming for her arguments. They were coming for her volume, her existence, her refusal to lose politely. That was the real tactic, dressed up as concern. Reframe confidence as arrogance and dissent as hysteria. Weaponize decorum like a velvet-cloaked guillotine. And if all else fails, call her young. By Sunday night, Karoline had made her choice. If Judge Barrett wanted to play constitutional chess on live television, then fine. But she wasn't going to follow the rules scribbled in the margins of some Federalist Society handbook. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She wasn't going to flinch, react, or take the bait like some undergrad being cold-called in con law. No, Karoline would stay grounded, speak precisely, and let the truth do the yelling. Her team didn't know the full plan. She kept it close. Tactical silence. Trust me, she told them, with the same calm you hear from surgeons and women who've been underestimated for too damn long. I've got this. By Monday, the digital rumor mill was grinding full speed. The upcoming panel had been blasted across Columbia's feeds like a Super Bowl for self-righteous legal minds. 2 firebrands. 1 stage. This Thursday. Viewers expected a cage match. The producers, pyrotechnics in pearls, and Barrett? She assumed this was her redemption arc, one more chance to deliver stoic barbs beneath the polite fiction of judicial neutrality. What she didn't know was that Karoline had a trump card, not the political kind, the kind typed in 12-point Times New Roman, double-spaced, internally reviewed, and damning in every syllable. A memo she hadn't written, but which carried her name like a target at the top of a list. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. And Karoline didn't pick Thursday by chance. That morning came cloaked in a stillness that felt almost disrespectful to what was about to detonate. The event was staged in Columbia Law's Watson Lecture Hall, chosen for its alleged neutrality, though neutral here meant neither woman taught here, and no one could be accused of home field advantage. In reality, it was a set designed for civility and built for spectacle. Mahogany paneling, 1,000 smug little angles of symmetry, and seating that screamed, "I donate annually." Karoline arrived 20 minutes early. She always did. Not for glam squad touch-ups or pre-game banter, but to study the battlefield, to breathe, to remind herself why showing up with restraint was the sharpest blade in the room. She didn't make small talk, just nodded to the crew, found a chair in the green room, and skimmed her notes with the intensity of someone reading classified intel. And on her lap, that Navy folder, the one Judge Barrett's team had assumed would never leave the draft stage, never once left her hands. Then, with all the grace of a political matinee queen, Barrett entered. She arrived precisely 7 minutes later, trailed by a communication staffer with tragic shoes and an assistant balancing a Louis Vuitton tote, a venti iced coffee, and what looked like a backup cardigan in case someone questioned her empathy. Barrett wasn't just present. She was performing, laughing too loudly, pivoting between handshakes and sound bites, treating the makeup room like it was the Harvard Club and every mirror was an amicus brief in her favor. She barely acknowledged Karoline, just offered a nod that hovered somewhere between condescension and clerical error, then moved past like Karoline was furniture, tastefully disruptive but still removable. One of the junior producers, bless her whisper-challenged lungs, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Is she always this quiet before panels?" Karoline heard it. She didn't reply. She just kept reading, calm, coiled, ready. Because what was coming wasn't noise. It was orchestration. And Judge Barrett? She was about to find out what happens when someone reads your playbook, out loud. Barrett flicked a glance toward Karoline, quick, performative, and pointedly hollow, then turned her gaze elsewhere, like someone scanning a menu and skipping the item they've already decided they don't respect. She always this monkish before a mic goes hot? A junior producer whispered, loudly enough for the dead to hear, and certainly loud enough for Karoline. Karolina heard. She didn't dignify it with a look, let alone a retort. She simply flipped to the final page of her notes, eyes steady, spine unmoving, like the silence was part of the argument. 10 minutes before they went live, a production assistant slipped into the green room, headset bobbing, voice brisk. "You're up in 10. Mics go on in 2. Karoline stood. She tucked the folder under her arm, like she was carrying an affidavit, confidential but about to become consequential, and stepped out into the hallway where a senior producer was reviewing last-minute cue cards with the moderator. "Quick flag," Karoline said in a low, precise tone, the kind that suggested she was not asking permission so much as extending professional courtesy. "There's a document I'll be handing the moderator during the segment. Ties directly to the topic. Nothing inflammatory, just clarifying context." The producer raised an eyebrow. In that world, clarifying context was code for brace yourself. But Karoline's delivery was so composed, so unapologetically exact, that it was hard to argue. As long as it doesn't torpedo the segment, the producer replied, scanning her face for signs of mischief. It won't, Karoline answered, smooth and final. It'll anchor it. She walked into the studio without preamble, without eye contact, without the performative handshakes politicians hand out like breath mints. She already knew the temperature of the room. It was fluorescent and too proud of itself. Barrett was already seated, mic clipped, smoothing the same section of her hair for the third time. She caught Karoline's entrance in the reflection of the monitor and, without turning, fired off a line dressed up like casual conversation and dipped in varnished venom. Oh, you actually brought notes this time. It was a jab meant to draw blood without leaving fingerprints. Karoline didn't blink. Always do, she said, settling into her chair. Just didn't require them the last time. Silence, dense enough to file as evidence. One of the camera techs coughed into his wrist. A production assistant adjusted lighting unnecessarily. Barrett's smile flickered, the smirk thinning like a bad legal argument under scrutiny. The moderator ran through the standard logistics, intro order, segment flow, scheduled breaks. Karoline nodded politely, her focus elsewhere. She already knew none of that would matter, because what she came to say wasn't on the cue cards. 3 minutes until airtime. Karoline clipped her mic with clinical precision. She opened the Navy folder again, not to review, but to stare down a single line from the memo, the one that had stayed lodged in her memory like a shard of glass under the skin. If they defend themselves too quickly, call it reactive. If they hesitate, call it rehearsed. Either way, they lose. She didn't whisper it aloud. She didn't need to. She wore it now, and what she was about to do, on camera, under lights, before a room full of handlers and Harvard-trained referees, was not for vengeance. It was for calibration, and if Judge Barrett thought this was going to be just another panel with polite fencing and post-segment lattes, she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of strategic clarity. The red light blinked on. They were live. If she hesitates, call it rehearsed. If she responds too fast, call it emotional. Either way, frame the fallout like it was her fault for not staying silent. Karoline didn't say it aloud. She didn't have to. It wasn't a mantra. It was a warning label that had been stapled to women like her for decades. She carried it, not like a burden, but like a blueprint for dismantling every carefully constructed trap. The countdown ticked. 5, 4, 3. She took a long, even breath, blinked once. Nothing performative, just the final exhale before the curtain lifts and the knives come out. Karoline hadn't come to settle a score. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't even justice. It was disinfection. And disinfectant, as we know, tends to sting. When the red light blinked on, the moderator slipped into gear with his best cable news cadence. Polished, measured, painfully neutral. He introduced the segment, the institution, the stakes, and finally, the guests. Joining us today, he intoned, Karoline Leavitt, former White House Assistant Press Secretary and Policy Analyst, and the Honorable Justice Amy Coney Barrett of the United States Supreme Court. Cue the polite choreography. A curt nod from Barrett, imperial but accessible, the way she probably practices smiling in mirrors during recesses. Karoline gave nothing but stillness and a slight incline of the chin, like she was here for a deposition, not a duet. The opening questions were political wallpaper, border policy, federal funding, constitutional overreach. Barrett dove in early, words slick and surgically precise. She spoke like she was still in oral arguments, dismissing nuance, flattening complexity, and deploying legalese the way magicians use smoke. Every sentence was a soundbite with tenure. To the untrained ear, it sounded like mastery. To anyone paying attention, it was deflection wrapped in Latin. Karoline let her run. Let her build her little tower of gravitas, brick by brick, doctrine by doctrine. Then came the fifth question, the one that changed the rhythm. Ms. Leavitt, the moderator began carefully, how do we elevate public discourse when so much of it has devolved into personal attacks? A slight pause. Karoline tapped her pen once against the folder. Not for show, just to register the shift. I think, she said slowly, the better question is, who's cashing in on those attacks, and who's drafting the script? Barrett tilted her head with the smug grace of someone about to deliver a scolding disguised as curiosity. Is that supposed to mean something? Karoline turned to her, eyes calm and unhurried. You tell me. She opened the folder. Not dramatically. No raised voice, no flourish, just the same quiet confidence with which a prosecutor hands over evidence that's already been verified twice. She passed a single sheet across the desk to the moderator, her voice unshaken. This is a verified internal document from Justice Barrett's own advisory network. A communications brief, circulated within her legal circle, reviewed and approved. It outlines a targeted strategy to undermine conservative women who break from judicial orthodoxy. Not by countering their arguments, but by dismantling their tone. The studio temperature dropped 10 degrees. Barrett didn't speak. Karoline continued. It doesn't mention ideas. It mentions optics. It doesn't argue positions. It calibrates reactions. And yes, it names people. Specifically, women under 40. Specifically, dissenters. Specifically, me. She didn't need to raise her voice. The page did the shouting, and the silence that followed, it wasn't confusion. It was the sound of a reputation being audited in real time. It's all laid out, Karoline continued, voice still composed, as though she were reading weather patterns rather than exposing institutional sabotage. Create tension, elicit emotion, then spin it as instability, manufacture a reaction, and condemn the reaction you manufactured. Barrett blinked, once, then again, clearly not prepared for the part where the other woman brought receipts instead of tears. She gave a dry, almost theatrical chuckle, the kind of noise people make when they run out of legal doctrine and start reaching for disbelief. This is absurd, Barrett said, shaking her head like a disappointed schoolmarm who'd found graffiti in a textbook. It's fabricated. Karoline didn't bother to respond to the accusation directly. She simply gestured to the paper, now sitting in front of the moderator, as calmly as someone pointing out a fire exit. You're welcome to read it yourself, she said. Dated, initialed, reviewed by 2 senior members of your Legal Communications Advisory Board. It names me and 2 other women under 40 with the exact descriptors we've been called in public: reactive, combustible, and, my personal favorite, difficult to contain under pressure. The moderator glanced down at the memo. His brow furrowed. Then his mouth twitched in the slightest way, like he'd just read something too honest to ignore and too explosive to pretend away. I didn't show up to perform, Karoline said, turning back to Barrett, her voice the verbal equivalent of a surgical scalpel. I came to ask why something this calculated, this cynical, is being passed off as strategy. Why are we pathologizing dissent? Why is the response under the microscope instead of the provocation itself? Barrett sat forward now, voice pitched higher, tone sharpening like it was stepping out of its robes and into campaign mode. This is exactly the problem with your generation. You make everything about identity. You don't bring arguments. You bring drama, You're not under attack. You're just allergic to accountability. The tension in the studio jumped a full octave. One of the camera operators visibly winced. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "I'm not allergic to accountability," she said. "I'm insisting on it." "What you just said? That is the playbook. Deflect with generalities, undermine with tropes, discredit with volume when logic fails." Barrett's voice snapped like brittle parchment. "You engineered this. You baited me. You came here to go viral, not to discuss the law." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "No. I came here to discuss the tactics used to avoid discussing the law. And your panic? That's not because it's untrue, it's because it's now undeniable." Barrett stood abruptly, her chair skidding slightly against the polished floor. Behind the scenes, a control room erupted into confused murmurs. One producer gestured wildly toward the stage, mouthing "cut it," while another, clearly smelling Emmy bait, shook her head and whispered, "Keep it rolling." The moderator tried to steer the wreckage back to structure. "Let's, return to the—" But Barrett wasn't done unraveling. "You blindsided me with forged documents," she snapped. "You want to make this about womanhood and victimhood because you can't stand toe-to-toe on ideas." Karoline leaned forward, her voice almost too soft for the mic, but every word landed like a gavel strike. Real debates require truth. If your entire strategy is predicated on silencing people before the conversation starts, then maybe it's not ideas you're defending. Maybe it's the illusion of authority. That was it. The final crack in the stained glass window. The panel dissolved. The moderator, now officially out of lifeboats, called for a commercial break. The cameras didn't cut fast enough. Those extra 9 seconds? They would break the internet before lunch. Barrett's mic hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a gavel dropped mid-verdict. The audio caught the tail end of her muttering. Just one sentence, tossed off like an afterthought, but packed like a legal brief. This is what happens when you let them talk too long. Them, one syllable, no footnote, no context, just enough gasoline to turn a flicker into a wildfire. Within the hour, social media was aflame. Hashtags sprang up like weeds on scorched ground. Barrett backpedals, Karoline called it, Memogate, let them talk. Threads unraveled and rewove at lightning speed. TikTokers reenacted the moment in full robes and powdered wigs. Redditors posted frame-by-frame breakdowns of Barrett's facial expressions. YouTube exploded with reaction videos titled, "Things like Barrett melts down in real time and how Karoline Leavitt took a Supreme Court justice to school without raising her voice." Zoomed-in screenshots of the memo were passed around like sacred scrolls. Analysts dissected the language. Lawyers weighed in on authenticity. But it wasn't just the document people were obsessing over. It was the delivery. Karoline hadn't raised her voice, hadn't wagged a finger, hadn't done any of the things that usually make headlines. She had simply stayed still. And somehow, that stillness screamed louder than Barrett's eruption. By Friday morning, the clip had passed 3 million views across platforms. News anchors on cable tried to frame it as a generational clash, while podcast hosts and Instagram political accounts cut straight to the marrow. Power panicked when it lost control of the narrative. The moment had moved beyond the studio. It had seeped into kitchen tables and subway rides, into Slack threads and staff meetings. Even people who hadn't watched a minute of the panel could recite Barrett's final line, and Karoline's unblinking stare in response. In Dallas, a retired school teacher shared the clip with the caption, "I spent 30 years being told to stay composed while being undermined." Karoline just turned composure into confrontation. In Bakersfield, a political science sophomore wrote, "This wasn't just a debate. It was exposure. Proof that calmness only counts as professionalism when it protects the powerful." And in Lansing, a senior strategist for a rising Senate candidate, admitted to a reporter, off the record of course, that the memo felt uncomfortably familiar. "We've seen versions of it. Hell, we've drafted versions of it. The only difference, Leavitt didn't just leak it, she detonated it. Because, in the end, it wasn't about the memo being real. It was about the fact that for once, someone had the gall to hold it up in public and say, look, this is what's been hiding behind civility all along, and what came next would ensure no one in that room, not the audience, not the producers, and certainly not Judge Amy Coney Barrett, could pretend they hadn't seen it. The memo itself was damning. But what shattered the room wasn't just the content. It was the quiet around it, the silence that had made space for it to exist in the first place. What Karoline exposed wasn't a single document. She cracked open a culture of strategic suppression wrapped in professional respectability. That was the real shock. She didn't just name the play. She named the pact that kept everyone pretending it wasn't happening. Barrett's camp scrambled like a clerical staff told their emails were now FOIA accessible. The first move came Thursday night in the form of a hasty statement, ghostwritten by a lawyer, rubber-stamped by a PR intern, and released with the conviction of a wet napkin. It called the document inauthentic and part of a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by ideologues. The sentence tried to sound authoritative, but landed like a bad Supreme Court dissent, technically constructed, morally hollow, and allergic to accountability. But by Friday afternoon, the scaffolding cracked. 2 former aides, one of them now working quietly in environmental policy, the other finishing a JD in Minnesota, stepped forward to confirm what most people had already guessed. The memo was real. Not just real, it had circulated widely. One of them even admitted that the phrase emotionally unpredictable under sustained scrutiny was common shorthand in internal staff briefings. That confession was the sound of the dam breaking. Suddenly, every anchor with a half-decent research team was asking what they'd been too timid to say the day before. How many campaigns use this tactic? How often are women, particularly younger ones, framed before they ever speak? Why did it take a calculated, calm confrontation from someone like Karoline Leavitt to make the country admit what it's tolerated for so long? Meanwhile, Judge Barrett vanished like a law clerk in an ethics hearing. 72 hours of digital nothingness, no media appearances, no op-eds, no photos of her exiting federal buildings with her signature beige clutch. According to a producer at a major news network, she nearly pulled out of a pre-scheduled interview, one that had been teased for weeks. Her advisors were panicking behind closed doors, debating whether to lean in or lie low. Barrett, for once, wasn't sure how to read the room, and that's because, for once, it wasn't built for her. Karoline, on the other hand, didn't take a victory lap. She didn't run to every cable outlet with a tagline. She didn't parade the memo like a scalp. No podcast blitz, no merch, no victory tweets with champagne emojis. Instead, she stood behind a rickety podium outside a brick community hall in Manchester, New Hampshire, with 3 local reporters, 24 residents, and 1 overheated microphone. "I didn't bring that document to shame anyone," she said, her voice clear but unsentimental. "I brought it because too many of us have been told to shrug things off. We're told it's not that deep, that it's not personal, that we shouldn't make waves. Well, sometimes it is personal, and silence doesn't make us civil. It just makes us complicit." She paused, letting the air settle before meeting the camera's eye. You don't need volume to carry truth. You don't need cruelty to speak clearly. And you don't have to let someone rewrite your character just because they can't compete with your arguments. The clip didn't trend because it was flashy. It trended because it was unignorable. By the end of the weekend, It was the second most shared political video of the week, right behind the 9-second mic drop moment from the panel. But it carried a different kind of energy. Quieter, sharper, more enduring. It didn't scream. It sank in. And as it did, commentators began going back, re-watching archived panels, spotting the pattern in full high definition, the eye rolls, the interruptions, the patronizing chuckles disguised as civility. Moments where women, especially those who refused to toe the pre-approved ideological line, had been cut off, talked down to, or framed as unprofessional for responding like humans instead of statues. Now the footage hit different. Now the playbook had a name, and Karoline wasn't just holding it up. She was turning the pages out loud. The Leavitt-Barrett showdown didn't just spark conversation. It ripped the veneer off the whole operation. What people witnessed wasn't a viral moment. It was a paradigm shift, a recalibration of who gets to speak with authority and who's been muzzled in the name of maintaining decorum. Suddenly, people weren't just dissecting what was said. They were interrogating why it had taken this long to be said out loud. But Karoline never came for the clicks. This wasn't engineered for likes or algorithmic applause. She hadn't gone in with viral ambition. What she really wanted people to see, what would land even harder than the memo itself, hadn't surfaced yet. Not until 3 days later, when a local reporter from a mid-market station in Toledo, Ohio, did what national outlets with multi-million-dollar budgets couldn't be bothered to do. She picked up the damn phone and called the source. Her name was Grace Lynn. 27. Political novice. Graduate fellowship at a respected policy institute. First job on a high-profile judicial advisory team. She was the kind of intern you imagine nodding earnestly in meetings and writing down things like circle back and optics matter without irony. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the fallout. No press, no podcasts, not even a no comment in a hallway. Just silence. Until that call. I couldn't sit with it anymore, she told the reporter, her voice trembling with the strain of moral clarity finally released. The more I watched what they were building behind closed doors, the language, the planning, the cold rehearsals for reputational takedowns, the less it felt like politics. It felt like sabotage, manufactured collapse. They weren't just countering positions. They were pre-writing humiliation. She paused before continuing. They talked about Karoline like she was a malfunctioning microphone, something to fix or mute. Not a human being, not a colleague, just an optics problem. Grace hadn't leaked the memo on impulse. This wasn't the spontaneous act of some disillusioned temp. She sat with it, reread it, annotated it even. Then she waited. She waited until she knew Karoline would be on that panel. She didn't know whether Karoline would use the document, but she hoped, prayed even, that she'd do more than just reference it. I wanted someone to put the thinking on trial, Grace said, because these weren't accidents. These were instructions, and they were designed to silence people who already had to scale walls just to speak in the room. When Karoline's team read the article, they didn't blast out a tweet. They didn't send press kits or queue up a podcast tour. They just sent her a direct message, plain, undecorated. Thank you for the kind of courage we're all told to keep quiet about. That night, Karoline went live. No stylists, no studio lighting, no campaign backdrop with 100 American flags begging for attention. Just her, hair pulled back, plain tee, sitting in the dim lamplight of her home office, speaking directly into the lens like she wasn't addressing half the country. Just one person at a time. No notes, no handlers. Just questions from the comments feed blinking like signal flares. One viewer typed, "Why didn't you go harder? You could have obliterated her." Karoline paused. She took a slow sip from a chipped ceramic mug, then leaned slightly toward the camera, the way someone does when they're done filtering their answer. "Because I didn't need to destroy her," she said. "That memo spoke louder than I ever could. And the truth? The truth doesn't need to scream, or showboat, or stage a takedown. It just needs air. You give it space, and it'll do the rest." The comments lit up. Another question blinked onto the screen. "What do you hope happens next?" Karolina's tone softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "I hope the next time someone calls a woman unhinged for standing her ground, someone else asks why that word came so easily. I hope campaigns stop paying consultants to manufacture character assassinations and start paying attention to actual policy. And I hope the next time a woman is calm in the face of disrespect, people don't mistake her silence for surrender. I hope they recognize it for what it is: discipline, precision, power." The chat flooded with messages. This is what leadership looks like. No theatrics, just truth. She didn't have to shout. She made the whole room listen by being still, because in the end, it wasn't just about the memo. It was how she revealed it. Not with outrage, but with restraint. Not to score points, but to peel back the illusion. On a platform designed for hot takes and interruptions, she gave the country something rarer: silence. Unapologetic, tense, purposeful, and in that silence, something ancient stirred: clarity. 3 days later, Judge Barrett re-emerged, not in person, of course, but via a pre-recorded apology video so sterile it could have doubled as an onboarding module for ethics training. She blamed the incident on miscommunication, cited stress, said she had never personally reviewed the document, and called it unauthorized. It didn't land. The public had already seen too much, heard too much, felt the familiarity in every syllable of that memo. And more importantly, they had watched someone call it out without flinching. Karoline didn't respond to the apology. She didn't need to, because by then, the memo had done more than tarnish a reputation. It had cracked a facade, held a mirror to the very architecture of manufactured respectability, and dared people to actually look. And for once, they didn't look away. But moments like these don't cause revolutions on their own. They don't change the system by going viral. The weight of transformation doesn't lie in a clip. It lies in the aftermath, in what people choose to do when the cameras turn off, when the hashtags cool, when the silence returns. Because the real reckoning isn't the reveal. It's what happens when truth, finally spoken, refuses to be buried again. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since the broadcast sent Columbia Law's lecture hall and half the country into a moral tailspin. The hashtags had cooled, the news cycle had moved on to someone else's scandal, and yet, in a small community center in Concord, New Hampshire, Karoline Leavitt stood behind a scratched folding table, speaking to a crowd of barely 100. No velvet backdrop, no curated Instagram story, no press pool salivating for a follow-up moment. Just a mic that cut out every third syllable and a mismatched sea of folding chairs, half filled with retirees, student organizers, and a few locals who'd wandered in because they recognized her from a clip they'd seen wedged between cat videos and Senate gaffes. During the Q&A, an older woman in the second row raised her hand. Her voice came low and lined with experience. "I saw that panel. And I gotta ask, how'd you stay so calm when she was coming for your throat like that?" Karoline looked down for a beat. Then she lifted her eyes to meet the woman's directly. "You breathe," she said. "You remember why you're sitting at the table, and you realize it's not just your voice you're holding up. It's all the voices that were never invited into the room. A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind across dry leaves. Then another voice, younger this time, called out from the back. But don't you ever feel like you're being forced to be perfect? Like one mistake, and they'll turn you into a punchline? The room stilled. Karoline gave the kind of nod that doesn't just mean yes, it means often. All the time, she said. But I stopped chasing perfect. Perfect's a moving target anyway. I aim for steady. I aim for clear. Because the people coming next, they need more than a moment. They need momentum. And you can't give them that if you burn out playing a game you didn't design. Applause rose. Not the performative kind. The kind that starts slow, unsure, and builds because something in the room has shifted. That night, Karoline sat alone in her parked car, engine off, the glow of her phone screen soft against the dashboard. She scrolled through 100 messages, then paused on one. A DM from a middle school teacher in Des Moines. My 8th grade girls watched your segment in civics class. One of them asked, why did the judge get so angry when Karoline stayed calm? I didn't have the perfect answer. So I said, because that's what power looks like when it refuses to flinch. Karoline stared at the message, thumb hovering, then slowly smiled. It had never been about Barrett. Not really. It hadn't even been about the memo, although that had torn off the mask. This was about something deeper, the fatigue of being misread, the exhausting calculus of being palatable enough to be heard, but not too much to be punished, and the quiet revolution that happens when someone finally calls that bluff. The next morning, she posted just one sentence. Let the moment speak. But after that, let the work begin. No ribbon cutting, no gloating, no interview blitz. Because Karoline didn't need applause. She needed people to pay attention, not just to her, but to every voice that had been filtered through labels like aggressive, difficult, or too much, just because it didn't come with a stamp of approval from the right circles. Because the truth, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like precision, like sliding a document across a desk and saying, this is real. Now decide what you'll do with it. And while the headlines faded and the next panel of talking heads replaced the last one in an endless churn of scripted outrage, what Karoline left behind wasn't a spectacle. It was a mirror, one that some people still weren't ready to look into. And others? They couldn't stop staring. So if something in this story made you pause, made you shift in your seat, or nod without knowing why, don't just swipe past it. Sit with it. Share it. Say something. Because the real danger was never the truth. It was how long they thought they could hide from it.